Welcome to you all. I'm Victoria McKenna. I'm the Director of Alumni and Parent Engagement at the college. Seeing many of my 1970 friends just came off their first 50th reunion virtual event, and then many more friends here from our wonderful classes 1971 and above. Welcome. We certainly wish we were with you all here in New London on this somewhat overcast day. I am on campus right now, and we did not hope to celebrate with you virtually, but that is where we are, and we are so grateful for everyone's interest and support with this virtual program. So we've got close to 60 of you with us here, which is just a tremendous turnout, and we certainly will all be back on campus for our Sykes program next year. I just want to give a very special shout out to our 1970 and 71 guests with us today, celebrating their 50th reunions. It's been an absolute pleasure working with you both for the last year or two. I am just thrilled with how your programs turned out and that we get to celebrate you through this program and many more events over the next week or so. I have the wonderful honor of introducing President Catherine Bergeron. Again, someone who would be toasting to you all in person, but here to greet you virtually and say a few words. So thank you, President Bergeron. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Tori, and welcome reunion classes and Sykes honorees. It's really such an honor to be with you today and to be able to welcome you all to this special celebration of two reunion classes, the classes of 1970 and 1971. Now, it's always special to reconnect as a community, but 50th reunions are something else entirely. They are historical, they are moving, they are almost magical in the way they reopen the doors of memory. And for me, that's the honor of it, to be able to walk through that door with you and to share in the momentousness of those memories. And perhaps, Tori, you can mute everyone so that we will not have the background noise.
I apologize. We're having trouble muting one alum, which I will direct message them right now.
Well, while we're doing that, I'm going to welcome some special guests with us who are in the Zoom room today, whose memories I think go way back. I'm speaking of 5 remarkable women from the class of 1951. That's Phyllis Hoffman Driscoll, Mona Gustafson Afinato, Susan Askin Wallman, Harriet Bassett McGregor, and Mary Jo Pelkey Shepherd. Just think of that. 70 years since graduating and still engaged with the college. It's really an honor to have you with us and have you help us welcome the newest members of the Sykes Society. I love the Sykes event too, because it makes me reflect on what the college was like during a very different moment in our history. And that's especially true for you members of the classes of 1970 and 71, who lived through a time like no other. It's hard to fathom the tectonic shift that occurred between the fall of 1966 or 67 when you arrived and 1970 or 71 when you departed. You arrived at an all-women's college and you graduated from a college that admitted men. You arrived at an institution with a conventional approach to residential education, with dorm mothers and parietal hours, and you left an institution that had revolutionized the residential experience with student self-governance. And you arrived, of course, as the US was escalating its involvement in Vietnam, and you left as the war had expanded to Cambodia, as the country reeled from the shootings at Kent State, and then from the disillusionment of the Pentagon Papers. This is the history that each one of you carries within you. And now it's embedded in the fabric of this college. And that's what I mean when I say that it's an honor to have you with us today and to relive it together. And I have to tell you something else. An extraordinary thing happened just yesterday that relates to your history. I had an unexpected visit from a former trustee, someone who had served on the board of Connecticut College during the period of transition to coeducation in the late 1960s and 70s. The year of COVID had caused him to go through his files, his papers, and he presented me with a yellowed folder of documents that he'd saved and that he thought we should preserve. And in it were, of course, newspaper clippings, various board correspondences, and there was also a letter. I have it right here. Let's see. Written by President Charles Shane to parents and alumni on May 11th, 1970, exactly 1 week after Kent State. It outlined what had happened on campus the previous week during a time that, as Shane put it, will probably enter current American history as the nationwide student strike. It described the student-led cessation of academic routines, the faculty's support, the joint steering committee appointed by Shane and the president of student government, the all-campus meeting in Palmer Auditorium on Tuesday, May 5th, 1970, and then the resolutions that emerged from that meeting. An incredibly heady time. And then the letter ends with a statement that I found quite moving. Shane writes, "Not all parents and alumni will agree with what we have done, but I would defend as correct and straightforward our methods for trying to discover and express the reasonable response of our campus majority. I am aware, as never before in the past 8 years, of the complexity of our educational mission in the 60s and 70s. What I would like especially to emphasize is that it was the collective expression of our purpose, the close continuing relationships between teacher and student that gave our 4 days their special quality. I think we are better prepared than we ever have been to keep Connecticut College a vital place for teachers to teach and students to learn." And that's how the letter ends. Now, what struck me is that this reaffirmation of the college's mission 50 years ago, undertaken in a vibrant context of shared governance, it set the stage for the work that has continued to make Connecticut College such a vital place to teach and learn today. And at no time was that more in evidence than in the past year, as we rethought every aspect of our academic and residential experience together in order to continue to fulfill this mission during a global pandemic. Our ability to do what we did is strongly connected to the work you did as students to make Connecticut College a better place. You transformed the college and paved the way for the work of generations of students who follow you. And I am so, so grateful for that. And it's with that story in mind, that I'm excited to introduce you to today's Sykes lecturer. He is an extraordinary teacher and scholar who has not only dedicated his career to close continuing relationships between teacher and student, as Sykes put it, but he has also devoted his scholarship to thinking about exactly those kinds of transformative events that changed the course of history. I'm speaking of Derek Turner, the class of 1943 professor of philosophy and associate director of the Goodwin-Niering Center for the Environment. For Professor Turner, it all starts with dinosaurs, with the time before history and before the dawn of human civilization. when these extraordinary creatures roamed the earth. So he takes a very, very long view. He is the author of 3 books: Making Prehistory from 2007, about historical science and scientific realism; Paleontology from 2011, considering the study of dinosaurs from a philosophical perspective; and his most recent book, Paleoaesthetics, on the art and practice of paleontology, published in 2019. He completed work on this book, I believe, in 2017, when he held a Fulbright visiting research chair in philosophy of science at the University of Calgary, Canada. Now, all of Professor Turner's research deals with the philosophical frameworks for natural science and the deep history of the environment. And these subjects in turn revolve around a larger issue of what he likes to call historical contingency, about what might have become of history if certain things had not happened, right? So for those of you in the classes of 1970 and 71, I think this is a particularly poignant question. And it's the subject of his talk today, which he is calling The View from Our Historical Here, Reflections on Historical Contingency. Won't you join me in welcoming Professor Derek Turner?
Thank you so much, President Bergeron. Maybe should I go ahead and share my screen? Okay, can everyone see that okay? Okay, great, I'm excited. Okay, so first of all, thank you so much, President Bergeron, for that flattering introduction, but it was also an awesome introduction that set things up perfectly for what we'll talk about a little bit today. And I just want to welcome everyone, and thanks for the invitation to join today for this for this Sykes event. It's a real honor to be able to meet with you from the class of 1970, 1971. So I'm just excited to be here. I was thinking, I know we're all here on Zoom today. I was thinking that, you know, given that we're still operating in this kind of remote way, that it might be nice to start with a visit to campus in a way. So I thought I'd share with you all my own favorite spot on campus, which is really special. And I love to share this with students too. Not enough people know about this. On campus, we have a metasequoia tree, sometimes known as a dawn redwood. And this is it right here. A couple of pictures I took a little while ago. And I want to just kind of begin thinking about this tree a little bit. It's a really interesting example of what biologists sometimes call a living fossil species, actually. This thing looks very, very, very much like fossils that we have in the fossil record from the late Cretaceous, the time of the dinosaurs. So President Bergeron mentioned dinosaurs. I'm not only interested in dinosaurs, but also the other stuff that was living around the same time. These metasequoia trees were around, and Western scientists knew them from the fossil record originally, had thought they were actually extinct until in the 1940s, a population was discovered in China. And even today, there's a wild population of several thousand trees in China. It's actually quite endangered in the wild, though many of these metasequoias have been planted in arboretums around the world. So there, lots of people grow them, but the wild population is quite small. So these trees survived a mass extinction event that wiped out many other plant animal species. And when I think about this particular example, I think a lot about just sort of how lucky we are that the thing is there. It was a close call. We'll just put it that way. It was a very close call. They could have easily gone extinct 100 years ago in the wild before scientists rediscovered them and people started kind of planting them, right? So it was a very close call. Just if you're ever back on campus and want to take a look at it, it's right here between Shane Library and Crow on the little sidewalk there. It's a really neat spot to go visit. Now, one of my intellectual heroes is this paleontologist, Stephen Jay Gould, who wrote this amazing book that's had a big impact on me called Wonderful Life in 1989. And Gould, in this passage, this is I think the only quotation I'll actually show you today. We'll mostly look at pictures, but Gould has this interesting reflection on humanity, on us, and he also notes that our existence today is a bit of a close call, kind of like the metasequoia trees. So Gould says, we came this close. Put your thumb about 1 millimeter away from your index finger, thousands and thousands of times to erasure by the veering of history down another sensible channel. Replay the tape 1 million times from Burgess beginning, and I doubt anything like Homo sapiens would ever evolve again. It is indeed a wonderful life. Gould plays around with this idea of rewinding the tape of history and playing it back. And this is kind of what I want to invite us all to think a little bit about today. And the big issue is historical contingency. Now, philosophers kind of don't all agree exactly on how to define it, but just to kind of give us something to work with, the basic idea is that what happens later in history is highly sensitive to small changes in what happens earlier. And I don't know how clear this diagram is, but if you imagine kind of time running from left to right, if you go back in the past and you change something, right? If you change a variable or something different happens, it could be the downstream effects are really huge. It might seem that like what you're changing in the past is really tiny and insignificant. It could nevertheless make a huge, huge difference to what happens later. That's the kind of idea. Okay. I'm just going to say a little bit about my own work on this. A whole lot, as President Bergeron indicated, a lot of the different kind of issues I'm interested in exploring in philosophy of science kind of connect in one way or another to contingency. And so I thought I'd just mention a couple of things. There's ideas about evolution, like species selection, that kind of connect with contingency. I'm really interested in how contingency can affect our thinking about biodiversity loss today, from an environmental perspective. I'm really interested in what if counterfactuals, like what if things had been different. There's an interesting debate about, both in history and in science, about the legitimacy of kind of speculation about what might have happened if things had been different. As the quotation from Gould suggested, I'm kind of interested in how this connects with just the place of human beings in the larger scheme of things. Questions about narrative explanation in science, where scientists often explain things by telling stories. And I think there's interesting questions about how that connects up with the questions of contingency. And then also questions about what's the difference between scientific issues and more philosophical issues? And when we start exploring these questions about contingency, you can kind of lose track of even of whether you're talking about science or talking about philosophy. And there might also be connections to questions of religion as well. Okay, this is the same quote we looked at earlier. I just want to come back to a detail. Gould mentioned replaying the tape 1 million times from a Burgess beginning. I want to look at that a little more closely and see kind of what he had in mind there. What is he talking about with the Burgess beginning? Well, he's talking about this amazing place in Canada, in Western Canada, the Burgess Shale. And this is just a silly picture of me with a few friends in in 2017, we took a guided hike up. You're not allowed to just go there and see. It's a very, very special place. We took a hike with a guide up up the slopes of, this is Mount Stephen in British Columbia, and to see this particular spot. This is one place where you can see the Burgess Shale, which is a special kind of shale formation. The rocks here are about 508, 510 million years old. So we're talking really, really old. For context, dinosaurs first evolved like 240, 230 million years ago, something like that. This is more than twice as far back in time as the earliest dinosaurs. A couple of other fun pictures. This is kind of looking upslope. You get a sense of kind of what the landscape looks like. And this, the hillside that we're on is, I don't even know how to describe it. It's amazing. There's no way to kind of walk around without walking on the talus, on these kind of slabs of shale. Every third or fourth one you turn over has fossils in it. I've never been any place like it. It is completely extraordinary. You see most of the fossils at the spot where we were at are like this. They're these little trilobite fossils, which are really common. But the Burgess Shale more generally is full of these amazing soft-bodied fossils from this moment in the history of Earth when multicellular animals were first beginning to evolve and kind of go crazy and take all these wild and interesting forms. This is also a really special spot geologically. We think it was at the base of an offshore continental shelf. So the critters were kind of like swimming around in the oceans and dying, and then their bodies were kind of washing off to the bottom of this continental shelf, and where they ended up in a really anoxic environment. So they didn't quite decompose rapidly the way they would in other places, and they got kind of buried with layers of sediment, and you end up with these really exquisite, thin, filmy kind of fossils that also preserved soft body parts, soft tissue parts in the most amazing way. And these are just some of the wild and crazy organisms that we have evidence of from this time, the Cambrian period. Some of them are kind of more familiar trilobite kind of things, but this one, just for example, the one on the top right here, scientists called hallucigenia because they thought they were hallucinating when they first looked at the fossils. It's got spikes going up one way and tentacles the other way, and nobody could tell which was the front end and which was the rear end. It's a really crazy little tiny organism, and nobody knew, is it a worm? Is it like what is the thing? And this thing down here on the lower left called Opabinia is a bizarre creature with like a little schnozzle that it maybe ate with, like a feeding thing, and it's got 5 eyes, which is weird. So it's just all kinds of strange things in the Burgess Shale. Let me advance. One other example, this is a fossil that we actually saw when we were there. I get so excited about this one. There are a lot of these things that look kind of like shrimp tails, and the scientists who first described them a little over a century ago actually classified this as anomalocaris, which means just like strange or bizarre shrimp. That's what they thought it was at first. It turns out when they found some more complete fossils, including the soft body preservation, they realized they were wrong. It actually looks like this. And what you're looking at is not the tail at all. It was like the feeding appendage. It had a couple of feeding appendages up in the front. And this was probably like the top predator in the oceans at the time. It was actually 2 or 3 feet long in all, which was huge compared to all these other critters at the time. Kind of an interesting thing. Also, I hope it's, I don't know, I drew this thing. I kind of have fun once in a while kind of doing my own little sketches of little critters. Okay, so how does this relate to contingency? Okay, so here's what Gould is thinking. He's looking at this amazing diversity of body plans in these early multicellular organisms in the Burgess Shale. And he's thinking, well, you know, some of these things went extinct and some didn't, right? In fact, most of these end up kind of disappearing, right? And Gould is looking at this one. This is actually kind of the more boring one, but he looks at this one and speculates that it's called Pikaia is the scientific name that the I think Charles Doolittle Walcott, the scientist who was originally kind of classifying these, gave to it. And the thought was, well, this thing or something like it might actually be our ancestor. It might be the thing that would eventually give rise to all vertebrates, you know, fish initially, amphibians, birds, you know, dinosaurs, mammals, the whole shebang, right? Gould kind of looks at this and asks, well, what if it had been different, right? What if it wasn't our possible ancestor that survived, but something else? I mean, what if the ancestor of all vertebrates had gone extinct? What if something had just happened, you know, 510 million years ago to wipe out the ancestor of all vertebrates? And maybe instead of the world we have, we've got a planet that's inhabited by the descendants of something else, something really weird, right? And so just for fun, we can, I don't even know how to begin imagining this, but take a little organism like Anomalocaris or one of these others, and just imagine, you know, how different the planet would look if there were no mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, fish even, but we were talking about a world populated by the descendants of something else that was around 500 million years ago. So this is like contingency in a big way. a small difference, like, does this thing go extinct or does that thing go extinct? You run that out over 500 million years and you get a planet whose biosphere is completely unrecognizable. And this is kind of, excuse me, this is the thing that really animates Gould's thinking. And I just find this a really compelling sort of thing to consider. Okay, so the thing about contingency, though, is that you can ask these like what if questions at different scales. So, you know, in most of my work, I think about the big scale. You know, what the grand sweep of the history of life on Earth, like, what's the big story about evolutionary history? And if that's what you're interested in, you know, we could go back and kind of join someone like Stephen Jay Gould in thinking or asking, like, what would have happened if things were a little bit different 500 million years ago? But we don't have to go back that far. We could ask, you know, what would have happened if we hadn't ended up at Connecticut College? You know, if our lives at a much smaller scale had taken a different turn somewhere, right? It's really the same kind of question. Lately, we could even shrink the time scale back and just rewind history back to a year and a half ago and think, oh my gosh, you know, kind of how different would life be right now, you know, if things at the very beginning of the pandemic had gone differently, or if it just hadn't happened, you know. So these kind of what if questions, I have to say, as a philosopher, I'm just completely struck over and over again by the way in which these very same questions, they show up in science, right? These are questions that scientists care about and try to investigate and disagree about sometimes. We could talk more about that if you're interested. Scientists sometimes disagree about how to answer these kind of what if questions. what if things had been different? But there are also questions that we can ask just in life, you know, about to help us kind of get our bearings, you know, how would life today be different if I hadn't met this particular person, or if I hadn't been at this particular place at a particular time? Okay, I have to apologize for the pun. I couldn't, so I was kind of just thinking about pursuing this a little bit more, and thinking about like contingencies in our own lives. Like, you know, if we hadn't, okay, contingencies is cheesy, but the thought is, I think, a serious one. Like, if we hadn't, for each of us, it's going to be different. But if we hadn't um, found our way to Connecticut College at a certain point in life, you know, what difference would that make to our lives? It might actually be like a pretty small detail that could make the difference as to whether we're finding our way to Con College or not. And you change that small detail, and you might change a lot about our individual lives. In my case, this is just a silly bit of history, but I've been here at the college about 20 years, and I was the second person in line. I was not the first person to get the job offer. And I've thought many times over the years, oh gosh, you know, like what if that person who got the offer first had accepted it? I wouldn't be here. My entire, and very much about my own like intellectual kind of trajectory would be really, really, really different if I hadn't. I'm not sure what it would be like, but it would be different if I had not ended up at Connecticut College. And I'm grateful that I did. So just to share, to make this a little bit more personal, and share a couple things about you know, things that I sort of discovered after coming to the college that I never would have run into, you know, in any other place. Things that are really peculiar to Connecticut College. So this is a picture of two colleagues. Mel Woody is on the right, and Kristen Pfefferkorn on the left. And they were just, they're wonderful, dear colleagues who were in the philosophy department when I joined, and just were incredibly kind and helpful in my early years at the college. And just, I think the world of them both. They're fantastic. And they had a big impact on me, both of them in different ways, actually. Both of them shaped my approach to philosophy, my sense of kind of what I'm up to in doing philosophy. And so Mel Woody, for example, I remember vividly an early conversation with him. We were talking about geology. He was interested in earth science, and he said, well, you know, there's all this great stuff in philosophy of history from the 1960s, 1950s, 1960s, these thinkers like W.B. Galley, for example. And Mel just said, you know, you have to read this stuff. And I was like, okay, I'd never heard of any of this stuff before. And I did, at the time, a bit of a dive into this literature and philosophy of history. And sure enough, this helped set me on the path to thinking about contingency. Actually, I want to suggest that some of my interest in contingency is actually contingent on some of these, on actually ending up at Connecticut College and learning a bit from Mel about philosophy of history. I've since learned, this is, I don't know how interesting this is, but Stephen Jay Gould, you know, kind of who's the scientist who made a big deal of contingency, went to Antioch College as an undergraduate, and he studied philosophy, and he studied philosophy of history, and he was reading some of the same stuff actually as a college student. And so it's really thanks to Mel Woody when I got to here at Con College, who kind of shared that stuff with me. Another thing I have to, I'm changing topics a little bit, but I'm so into this right now. I just have to share. It's also Mel Woody and Kristen Pfefferkorn who introduced me to the work of Suzanne Langer, who is a philosopher. If I had ended up at any other place, I probably today would know nothing about Suzanne Langer. Mel and Kristen invited me to participate in a reading group. This was at least 15 or 18 years ago. We spent the summer in New Haven getting together once in a while, reading some of Langer's work, and it had a huge impact on me. And I remain super interested in Langer. In case maybe you're familiar with her, I don't know, if in case not. So she taught philosophy at Connecticut College from 1954 to 1962. She's the author of a bunch of books, Philosophy in a New Key, a textbook on symbolic logic, which is fantastic. This is a bust of her that we have in Shane Library up in the special collections, which is kind of cool. She's the only member of the Connecticut College philosophy department to ever have a sculpture made of her, which is pretty great. Anyway, I could easily have taken this half hour and spent it entirely on Suzanne Langer. She has really influenced my thinking in all kinds of ways. Learning about her work has completely changed how I teach logic, for example. You know, my approach to working with students in my logic courses now is completely shaped by Langer. And especially meaningfully, after a lot of years of kind of kicking around the idea, this semester, Larry Vogel and I in the philosophy department finally got around to co-teaching a seminar on Suzanne Langer, which I've got to say, like, it's another contingency, right? Like, I never would have done this if I had ended up at any other place. And it was just one of the most special things. We had a fantastic group of students. President Bergeron joined us one day for a wonderful discussion of Langer's work on music. It was just a special sort of intellectual event, I guess, for me, which it's another one of these things that couldn't have happened elsewhere. In thinking about, I want to add one more thing. In thinking about contingency, I also think a lot about the students I've worked with. I was saying a bit just now about colleagues, you know, like Mel Woody and Kristen Pfefferkorn, who just made a big difference to me in different ways. But there are also a lot of students over the last 20 years who've shaped my thinking too, who you never would have met those particular people, you know, in any other kind of historical pathway. We had one special student, Leela Klauber, in the Langer Seminar this spring, who actually wrote a neat piece in the College Voice on Suzanne Langer, which was kind of cool. But there have been, I'll just say there have been many students I could talk about where just working with that particular student actually kind of nudged my own work in this direction or that direction, which it wouldn't have taken, you know, if I hadn't had that opportunity. So to think about wrapping up, I would love to discuss any of this with you all in the time that we have, but just to kind of think about wrapping up, I thought maybe this is not too exciting, but I was thinking about what I'm doing this summer, you know, what kind of thinking philosophically am I doing? It turns out both of the things I'm going to be working on in the next couple months are contingent, you know, on some of the things that I've talked about. So I'm going to be working on a paper on Suzanne Langer and her process philosophy of biology, which is an area of her work that I'm really interested in. And then it's coming out of this of the seminar that we just did, Larry Vogel and I. And then the other project is directly on contingency, and it's with another student who's had a huge impact on me, who just graduated a few weeks ago, Ahmed Abohamad, in the class of 21. We're working together on a paper on historical narrative, and fingers crossed we're going to get that included in a special issue of the Journal of Philosophy of History. And I'm actually co-editing that issue with a colleague, Allison McConwell, who's pictured here at the Burgess Shale. So Allison was part of our group. she was a graduate student at the University of Calgary at the time, and we went together up to see the Burgess Shale. And she's also really interested in contingency, and the special issue of the journal is contingency and values in historical science. And this is a picture of Ahmed down here. He's on the left. So we're going to be working on this together. So great. One final thought about contingency. So like everything I've said so far has been kind of backward looking back at deep history, or looking back on our lives and asking, what if this detail in the past had been a little bit different? But I also think a lot about contingency in a more forward-looking way. This could also be something we could chat about a bit. I think about this a lot in teaching, where small things, even an offhand remark or a particular reading that you assign, or you don't, as a teacher, you don't know what impact that's going to have on someone else's life, and they won't know either. They might not know until decades, and so I think about that a lot, kind of what are some of the various potentially small difference makers that we're doing kind of all the time to impact the people around us, and how does that play out? And we often don't know. It's kind of hard to say, but I think that that thought about contingency actually kind of raises the stakes sometimes on our interactions with other people, and just gives a new perspective on much of what we do. So with that, I will just say thanks and wrap up and see if you have any questions. I'd love to hang out for some discussion.
Wonderful. We do have a few great questions that have come in through the chat, and please do, I forgot to mention this in my opening, if others have questions, please populate them there, and I'll be working to ask Professor Turner those in the next few minutes. This first one has two words that I've had to Google in it, so please correct my pronunciation if I'm not getting this totally correct. Given the comment of Stephen J. Gould that you cited and are having come this close thousands of times to erasure, is belief in the existence of God unavoidable?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I love that question, because this gets at another philosophical issue that I'm really interested in, that's kind of lurking in the background of this discussion of contingency. I mean, I guess to give a quick and direct answer to the question, my own take on this is, no, contingency probably doesn't render belief in God unavoidable or something like that. However, one really interesting thing here is that I mentioned that scientists disagree about how contingent the history of life actually is. And that disagreement actually has some theological overtones to it. It's completely fascinating. So Gould, on his side, is really famous for defending a view that he calls non-overlapping magisteria. It's a mouthful. He calls it NOMA, not for non-overlapping magisteria. So the rough idea is that science and religion are just doing different things. They don't support each other and they don't conflict with each other. The reason is that they're just asking different questions. And that's kind of Gould's. He came up with this idea kind of back in the 80s and 90s at a time when there was lots of discussion of creationism. And Gould was trying to kind of just sort of come up with a view that would sort of keep, provide us with some way for science and religion to kind of get along. That was sort of the spirit of it. And so Gould himself would have said, oh, no, whether evolution is contingent or not, he would have said, it's just a scientific question, right? Doesn't really have any religious consequences. But there's another scientist, a guy named, a British scientist named Simon Conway Morris. This history is completely fascinating. Conway Morris was one of the researchers who was working on the Burgess Shale fossils and reclassifying them. His work, when he was at the start of his career, his work actually inspired Stephen Jay Gould's stuff on contingency. Later on, Conway Morris starts writing these books, arguing that Gould was completely wrong. Evolution's not contingent at all. Conway Morris was interested in convergence, which is the idea that evolutionary history can start off with very different kind of starting points, and given enough time, natural selection will generally tend to lead to the same great outcomes, right? So I wish I had pictures of this. The clearest examples would be flight. Flight evolves, and powered flight evolves insects, pterodactyls, pterosaurs, birds, bats. This is a classic example of what Conway Morris would have meant by evolutionary convergence. So he thinks he thinks actually evolution has some inevitable outcomes. Now, where they also disagreed though about science and religion. So Gould thought that like religion and science are doing different things and they can't really conflict or support each other, either one. Conway Morris actually has Christian theological commitments that he's pretty open about. And he thinks that convergence fits better with a theological interpretation because with convergence, you get the idea that, well, maybe it's not just luck. Maybe creatures like us, we're gonna happen, right? We're gonna happen. And that was sort of planned. You can easily see how you kind of shift into sort of talking about this a little bit more theologically. So anyway, so the reason I love this question is that I, as a philosopher of science, I look at this and I'm like, okay, there's a scientific disagreement that we should be sorting out by looking at fossils or doing biology. But the disagreement has these other layers to it. Really, for Conway Morris, there's a theological aspect to the disagreement that he has with Gould. So anyway, yeah, awesome question.
Thank you so much. And now we have quite a few coming in, so we will get to as many of these as we can. And this question is from a 1970 alumna who's been a longtime faculty member herself. I don't think philosophy, but she says, a question from a fellow admirer of Melvin Woody. Can you talk a little bit about contingency in relation to counterfactuals? How can this approach inform how we think about climate change?
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. Yeah, I was hoping some of you might have known Mel Woody too. That's just really exciting. The whole issue of counterfactuals is a kind of a future project for me that I really want to work on more. For everyone, so counterfactuals are a kind of a long-standing kind of hot topic in philosophy. Just for a little context, a counterfactual conditional is an if-then statement that's contrary to fact. So if something different had happened, then if I slept in this morning, then I wouldn't have joined you or so today or something like this. Would be a counterfactual. And there's a lot of discussion in philosophy and logic too about like how to think about counterfactuals. How do they work? What makes them true or false, right? A big question I'm interested in is like, how do we test them, right? So, one really basic thought about natural science is that scientists shouldn't mess around with hypotheses that they can't test empirically in some way with observation or experiment or by collecting data of some sort. Well, how do you test a statement about what might have been? All of our, intuitively, all of our evidence is about what actually happened. We don't have evidence about what might have happened, that things have been different. So like, how do you do that? So there's a big debate about just the legitimacy of counterfactuals in history. historians are really into this too, and historical science as well. I'm definitely on the side of things where I think counterfactuals are important and have some legitimacy. I love the example of climate science, in part because, wow, there's so much that could be said about this, but a lot of research in climate science involves modeling, constructing like really fancy, complicated um, uh, mathematical models of the climate system or the atmosphere and ocean system together, you know, and modeling practice often involves exploration of counterfactuals. That's kind of like the point of modeling, is that it lets you do that. You can kind of run the model one way and then go back and change a parameter or change a variable or change one of the inputs and run it again and see what happens. And that's how a lot of climate science works. And so there absolutely is a really interesting kind of connection between counterfactual thinking and like climate modeling and so on. I should stop. There's a lot more there to explore, but that's another wonderful question.
Great. Thank you. And then another question from one of our 50th alums. Can you talk about how contingency thinking can be used to inform present action? I am thinking about a bridge to a gratefulness practice.
Yeah. That's wonderful. I don't have that. I don't have those ideas well worked out or anything like that. But the phrase gratefulness practice is like wonderful. It's so wonderful, and it really captures something important, I think. I kind of just want to endorse that phrase, that term, and because I think that's in the spirit of what Gould was talking about in that quotation. You know, it's sort of humbling to realize, oh, you know, all these aspects of life that we might think of as blessings could have easily not happened, you know, and it's healthy, you know, to remind oneself of that. Yeah, definitely. I think there's a lot to explore here about how some of these notions of like contingency and convergence actually go into just like thinking about life and our interactions with other people, and this begins to get at that. Yeah.
Great. We're going to close with a little bit of a question comment from President Bergeron in the chat here. And she says, isn't a lot of scientific research based on counterfactuals? Suzanne Samard's work on trees was based on the idea that if the government did not have a monoculture replanting philosophy, then the plantations would have survived.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, that a lot of scientific research is based on counterfactuals. You know, it's one way to think about this. We could very quickly get deep into the philosophical weeds if we pursue this, but one way to think about this is, you know, another topic that philosophers are interested in is just cause and effect. You know, there's a ton of work in philosophy of science that's just looking at like, okay, when we say one thing caused another thing, what in the heck do we mean by that? How do we understand cause and effect claims? And one, it's not the only one, but one prominent approach to those kind of questions involves counterfactuals. And so some philosophers think that anytime we're making a claim about cause and effect, in the background, we're implicitly making counterfactual comparisons, because cause and effect claims are claims about variables and how they're related. So, and when we say that like this thing causes this thing, what we mean is if this variable had been different, this thing would have been different, you know? And so there's definitely like a camp of philosophers who'd say, well, yeah, you know, all scientific reasoning involves counterfactuals. Why? Well, because science is just an attempt to kind of get at cause and effect relationships, and that project itself involves counterfactual thinking, like from the get-go. It's interesting though, if you talk to some historians, there are some historians or historiographers who, I'll just say, who take a really dim view of counterfactuals. There are all these kind of interesting exercises in history. Oh, what if someone else had won this election, or what if the outcome of some battle had been different, or somehow so many of these examples involve elections and battles. But anyway, there's a historian of science named Peter Bowler who wrote a book one time called Darwin Deleted. And he's kind of asking counterfactually, like, well, what would have happened if Darwin never had been born? Would somebody have come up with natural selection? Or what, how would science be different? There are historians who think we shouldn't do that. who think, their attitude is like, look, when you're doing historical research, you should go to the archives and look at the evidence of what actually happened. And we don't have any evidence of what might have happened if Darwin had never been born. There's no evidence, is sort of the worry that some have. So in some quarters, this stuff is a little bit controversial. But anyway, yes, I completely agree that, yes, counterfactuals do have a big role in science. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Turner. If you have a chance, there's so much positivity and praise for you floating around the chat. Everyone is very engaged in this conversation with wonderful feedback, and we're just so grateful for your time. I don't think we ever thought our historical here would be celebrating with you all virtually, a moment for us that's so important to be with you all here in New London on campus, and we certainly can't wait to do that in the future. But thank you to this wonderful group of alums who gathered today, over 70 of you, for this conversation. And Professor Turner, for your time, and President Bergeron for being here with us. We certainly hope you'll engage in other pieces of our reunion program over the next, I think, 8 or so days. And 1970 still has a busy lineup today and tomorrow. So thank you, everyone, and looking forward to seeing many of you over the next few days.